that they are, they said, this doesn't make any difference. What are you talking about? Who will speak first? And I think when you have something to say, your ego never gets in the way. Dr. Clarke will be our first speaker. And Dr. Clarke will be presenting an aspect of the Garvey movement that I think is very significant and generally overlooked. Dr. Clarke will be addressing Marcus Garvey and the process of state formation. Marcus Garvey and the process of state formation. After Dr. Clarke speaks, Dr. Ben will be presenting to us philosophical concepts of Garvey and his African nationalism. And Dr. Ben would like to emphasize his, the word his, in that topic. So Dr. Clarke will speak first, then Dr. Ben, and we will have a question and answer period after the two brothers have spoke. So without any further ado, I'd like to bring to your attention Dr. John Henrik Clarke.
Thank you very much. This is my third visit to Hofstra. I'm very pleased to be here again, and I'm pleased to greet some of the same students again, and pleased that Dean Smith saw fit to invite me, and pleased that the President, with all the many things the President has to do, have taken time out to attend the lectures. Now, I'm talking about Marcus Garvey and the concept of state formation. I will begin by seemingly talking away from the subject, but I will be on the subject all of the time. And I will waste no time with trivia because the subject is bigger than the time allotted for it. What do we mean by state formation? There's some missing pieces in the history of African people that keep being missing because we do not look beyond what Professor Van Sertima calls the slavery curtain and the 500-year room when our history was locked into a room marked slavery, and we did not move it beyond that room or look at it before that room. We did not consider the fact that for most of the time African people have been on the earth. They have been free people determining their own destiny, and they have not been slaves. In the period of slavery for the Africans was short in comparison to other periods of slavery in the world. In fact, Europeans enslaved other Europeans for a longer period. To talk about state formation, in the restoration of state formation, we must speak at least briefly of independent states in Africa before the slave trade and how these independent states were lost. And with the loss of these independent states, the beginning of the slave trade in the 15th and the 16th century, the African was programmed into thinking that he had never ruled a state. And they were systematically read out of the respectful commentary of history. And so many times when the African away from home mentions slavery, the assumption is that is his total experience in history, because no one dares to look and see what happened before slavery. No one dares to say that slavery is an evil that has touched every people on the face of the earth sometime or the other, some way or the other. While the slavery that happened to Africans is the most documented and the most remembered,
It might have been the most severe. It is not the only. Now, let us look at just certain basic things that happened in Africa before slavery. Now, with the decline of the 25th dynasty, the last of the dynasties that came out of southern Africa, the Kushite dynasty, often called the Ethiopian dynasty, sometimes called the Nubian dynasty. With the decline of this dynasty, you can stop counting great dynasties. Because from then on, the foreigners, the invaders, the bastardized children of bastards began to rule the Nile Valley. This ultimately led to other invasions. The Assyrians, 666, then the Iranians again, then called Persians, 550. So brutal that the Africans cried out, "Oh God, if you cannot send me a liberator, at least send me a conqueror that will show some mercy." So when a young Macedonian, known in history as Alexander the Great, knocked at the door, he didn't have to knock very hard. The African, weary of brutal invaders, was not harsh on Alexander, who partly tried to keep the promise. He was an invader like all invaders, a raper. He raped the granary of Africa to feed his soldiers, because Africa was this part of Africa was a great agricultural country at the time. Now this fauna was followed by a more brutal form of Europeans, the Romans. And when the Romans stopped killing Christians and tried to become Christians, their mismanagement of this church and the dissatisfaction around it opened the door for the rise of Islam. The rise of Islam, Arab armies and African armies, pushed the European back into Europe, where they went into the Middle Ages, while the Africans, Arabs and Berbers, took over Spain and the Mediterranean. After the Crusades, Europe discovered that it was still hungry, still had lost 1/3 of its population, still was looking for routes to the east, something, spices, something they could put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. Europe was in a bad way. They had lost all sentimental attachment to themselves and to other people. They learned again maritime skill, mostly taken from China, translated by the Africans, Arabs, and Berbers at the University of Salamanca in Spain. They began to learn map making again and charting again. And to learn the coast of Africa, they discovered something called the Captain Atlas, and a catch of maps made by Jewish gold dealers who had been going into Africa dealing in gold in the Western Sudan. These are the maps that fell into the hands of Prince Henry, called Henry the Navigator. Now, with Europe on the rise again, back at sea again, they wasn't looking for Africa at all. They were looking for a route to the east. Africa appeared en route and proved to be more beneficial to them. Now, to justify slavery, they had to pretend that they were enslaving a people who had no history and who had no culture. And they forgot that there was another cluster of nations in inner Africa called the Western Sudan, nation that did not touch the sea, that had brought into being for over 1,000 years nation states. I'm not talking about grass huts and mud huts. I'm talking about nation states with ambassadors, with roads, with schools. In the last state, Sangay, a great university, Saqqara, a great scholar exiled by the Moroccans. This state was literally destroyed by an invasion from Morocco, Muslim against Muslim, using European mercenaries. Now, after this invasion and the wreck and ruin in the Western Sudan, the slave trade could spread inland. Because it is difficult to enslave a historical people, the rationale now is that these people had no history and no culture. And they forgot that Africans were in charge, and for many years, of the two major universities of the world, Salamanca in Spain, Saqqara at Timbuktu. Europe now had to forget the first African-European connection, the Romo-Grecian period. Now you can charge the Romans and the Greeks with many things, but generally they did not have color prejudice. They were snobs and they had a whole lot of things, and they had preferences, but there's a whole lot of difference between that and prejudice based solely on color. Now my point is, how did we lose the nation state? We began to lose the nation state when foreigners began to invade with weapons that we had never seen before, weapons that lacked humanity, that we had never even entertained using before and would not have used if we had them. Anytime you want to find out the weakest thing of about a people, look at the flip side of the weakest thing about a people, and you'll find potentially the strongest thing about a people. There was something in African humanity that did not lean to the total destruction of other people, similar to the Europe without sentiment of that day. Now, the traffic was not heavy between the beginning of the trade in the 1430s, 1438 to be exact, and 1492. You can't start a trade until you've got something for people to do. But the beginning of the trade, the opening up of the so-called New World, Africans began to be brought to South America and the Caribbean islands. The focal point here is the Caribbean islands. And the peopling of the Caribbean islands by Africans after the destruction of the Indians would create small island nations under different colonial domination. Now, to understand the background for Marcus Garvey, in the beginning of his concept of state formation, you got to look at Jamaica. You got to look at Jamaica's struggle against slavery, and the fact that Jamaica fought harder than Haiti and did not achieve independence, principally because they were destabilized in between battles. Haiti fought over a 20-year period, and they could take impetus from one revolt to start another revolt. And another incident, an item left out of history, is that Bokman, the Yoruba priest who solidified and organized the revolt in Haiti, was originally from Jamaica. When you look at the relationship of Jamaica and Haiti in the transformation of the system of slave revolts, here two nations, two island nations, where the people, remembering that they had not always been slaves, making an attempt to regain the concept of the nation state. When the British came, they wanted help from the slaves against the Spaniards. Some went to the hills and said, I don't want either one of you. These runaways were called Maroons. Marcus Garvey was a descendant of the Maroons. Now the Maroons are a special kind of Jamaicans. They're black and proud, and some of them were exceptionally skillful. Marcus Garvey was a master printer, so therefore he was also a reader. He was revolutionary from the beginning, with revolutionary ideas, calling the first printers' strike in Jamaica, visiting South America and Central America, and causing trouble wherever he had went, organizing Caribbean workers in the Panama Canal area. So Marcus Garvey had a sense of the state and what he had to do to regain it early in life. Now he would go to England, he would read, he would hook up with Duz Muhammad Ali, a an Egyptian of Sudanesian descent, in a newspaper called the African Times and Orient Review. He would read an editorial quoting, of all things, a white black nationalist named Booth, who had gone through parts of East and Southeast Africa. Because he was dissatisfied with the missionaries, he began to preach against them all. And he began to tell the Africans that the white man cannot be trusted. And when the African finally said, well, you're white, can you be trusted? To his everlasting credit, he said, no. Booth raised the first one to raise the choir, Africa for the Africans. Marcus Garvey read the editorial in Duz Muhammad Ali's paper and added Africa for the Africans, those at home and those abroad. Marcus Garvey never took anything from a second rater. He read fast and he learned fast. Now he's in London at the time of the race conference. There's a world conference on race. He's got that literature to read. The great activists from Ghana, Casely Hayford, John Mensa Sabah, now publishing their books, first in London, then secondly in Africa. He's got that literature to read. So he's absorbing the literature of the state. And the first version of a book that was going to be published, an extensive version in 1929, toward nationhood in West Africa. He would read. He's absorbing the concept of the state and the idea of regaining the state. Now he was to go back to Jamaica, and he would try to start the Universal African Improvement Association, Universal Negro Improvement Association. Why didn't he succeed in Jamaica? He didn't succeed in Jamaica then, and he wouldn't succeed in Jamaica now. The mentality was not there. Why didn't the Jamaicans buy the concept of the restoration of a state? Because they thought they already belonged to a state, the British Empire. And so his call for a state in Jamaica, his call for the return to Africa in Jamaica, did not fall on listening ears. He heard about a man named Booker T. Washington, and he wrote him. And Booker T. Washington invited him to the United States. He couldn't get the money ready by 1915, but when he arrived in 1916, Booker T. Washington was dead. Now, he would tour the United States in 1917. The riots were beginning to start. 1919, the Red Summer. In East St. Louis, they made bonfires and burned black babies to death. Now, after the riot in Chicago, where Marcus Garvey would rally blacks to fight back, he could now say to them, let's get out of here, let's get our own ships and sail back to Africa. Why did black America listen to the concept of the nation state and others did not listen? It had nothing to do with anybody having a better brain than the other. We were both under different oppressors. One oppressor gave you the illusion that you had a state. But the American oppressor did not even give us the illusion that we had one, ever would have one, or would be capable of having one, ruling one if we did have one. Europe dumped its human garbage can into the Western world. The worst of that garbage can was dumped into the United States. No illusions. The British oppressor was not less of oppressor. He was a more mature oppressor. He had style. His procedure. He would not cut your throat with a dirty knife, not because he cared anything about you or your throat, but it was poor style. He lacked form. It must be in good form, in good order. He was a mature oppressor. And you had a growing amateur oppressor in the United States, rather crude in comparison. So now, because Marcus Garvey had gotten across in this country something he couldn't get across in Jamaica. The American dream wasn't dreamed for you. The American promise wasn't made to you. I will dream for you a new dream, make a new promise, and lead you to a new land. The next year, he would call an international conference of African people, 30,000 people a day, and he turned away 30,000. Old Madison Square Garden. There have been 2 Madison Square Gardens since then. Now he would propagate the concept not only of a nation state, but of Africa's return to a nation state. He would begin to prepare the mind to think of a time in the world, in your history, when you ruled a state all by yourself, collected all the taxes, headed the army, did everything that a nation state need to do, received ambassadors, sent ambassadors. It would also remind us that in collective unity, we were a very powerful people in the world. We had been before and would be again. In spite of all of the forces arrayed against him, propaganda and otherwise, in spite of the fact that a good percentage of the people in his office was on the FBI payroll, the triumph of his movement was one of the great miracles, one of the great organizational miracles in the history of the United States. He now began to touch a people that had never been touched. He didn't have to steal them from the big church because it wasn't in the big church. He didn't have to steal them from the big organization. They were not in the big organization. He spoke a language that filtered down to the common man and woman, to the ordinary workaday man and woman. The membership in the Garvey movement, rather reasonable, like 50 cents a week and 10 cents burial benefit for burial insurance. That's rather reasonable for that day. Well, considering the fact that people were making $10, $15, $20 a week, it was still reasonable. Then he projected a dream that made people feel whole again. Imagine a black elevator operator, elevator starter, downtown New York. People say, "Hey George," call him everything. He was "Hey George" down there, but in the evening, with Garvey's paramilitary organization, he was a major and a general, controlling his troops for an empire still to come. Our mind in America was so depressed, we, more than any other African people in the world, needed a Marcus Garvey. We needed him to save us from believing that we were not going to make it as a people, for saving our sanity. Now, he began the collecting of funds for the ships, the Black Star Line. This will lead to difficulty later, but the main thing is that the Black Star Line was part of the concept of nation. He discovered that the shipping lines were so costly, and even transferring goods and services between African nations and African nations. He dreamed of a steamship line where Africans could connect with each other and trade with each other on terms. He prophesied the modern age. Now let's look at what could have happened just briefly. While we naively answer to the term minority, we were never a minority. We are ruled over by a numerical minority and don't even know it. Now, if you count all the African people in the United States, 30 million or more, in the West Indies, those in South America, especially Brazil, that has 80 million. You got about 200 million in the Western world. All the African people in the Pacific, 2 Pacific nations at the United Nations right now. African nations in the Pacific with a slight Polynesian admixture like the Australian Aborigine. People in other areas of the Pacific. A man came to our conference in Egypt this summer. He was a Dravidian. He represents 10 million people of African descent. Now, he wants to hook up again with African people. There's a new book called Delhi, dealing with the black untouchables of India, that there's upward of 100 million people of African descent in India. I know you met some brown races, but be that as it may, a whole lot of Indians are of African descent. Now these Indians of African descent want a connection with the rest of Africa. Now we and the Chinese might be the only people on the face of the earth who can count 1 billion people as part of our group. Or you want an economic system? Make shirts for 1 billion people. Make shoes for 1 billion people. Make cars for 1 billion people. Have the ships to transfer goods and services for 1 billion people. This is part of Marcus Garvey's dream. Nationness. And if you're going to have a nation, then you have to do everything people have to do in order to maintain a nation. His Liberia scheme consisted of sending men ahead of time who could manage brickyards, build bridges, lay railroads. He was thinking about the structure and the concept of nation. No one in the Western world, least of all the imperial powers, and America is an imperial power, wanted African people to emerge again in the world as the rulers of nations. You can bargain then. This is why all Africa is fragmented. This is no accident. Mostly fragmented by Western educated Africans. We have to think this over again. He kept telling us that the best education that we must have for nation would have to come from ourselves. He understood then what we do not understand now. Powerful people never educate powerless people in how to take that power away from them. Education has but one honorable purpose. One honorable purpose alone. Everything else is a waste of time. That is to train the student to be a responsible handler of power. Now, Marcus Garvey's venture with the ships led eventually to his arrest and imprisonment. And from his imprisonment, deported back to Jamaica. You might think the story ends right there. But during the Italian-Ethiopian War, a lot of Marcus Garvey's prophecy came to pass. He said, now look, see what happens? If you don't prepare yourself, any thug and his brother can come in and knock over your country, rape your women, kill off your educators. Then he was hard on Haile Selassie for leaving Ethiopia. He kept reminding them then that had you managed this state differently, had you made a hookup with other African people in the world instead of trying to prove that you're a Hemite or Semite, you got more help. Italians from the United States had no problem in going back and fighting for Mussolini. Why do we have so much problem going back and fighting for Ethiopia? They wouldn't have permitted us to do it in any case. Because they did not want us to relate to the concept of nation state. Marcus Garvey was the inspiration for the basis of the African independence explosion. He was the stimulation behind Nkrumah, especially Nkrumah, the first Pan-Africanist president, Nnamdi Ezekwe, Nigeria, Johnstone Kenyatta, before he started calling himself Jomo Kenyatta of Kenya. Marcus Garvey's inspiration to them from London, where he had lived for a number of years, helped to stimulate the concept of African freedom. And most of them, when they were willing to admit it, admitted that Marcus Garvey was the basic stimulation in their thrust for independence in Africa, in the restoration again of the independent state. Now the story is bigger than that. I have not dwelt with Garvey's second Jamaican years. When he went back to Jamaica, once more the Jamaicans would not listen, because Jamaica is the most stratified island, nation in the world along color and class lines, still is. If Marcus Garvey were alive today, walking through the streets of Jamaica, some misguided Jamaican might stone him to death. There is no Garveyism in the Caribbean today, very little Garveyism in the United States among black Americans today. Because if you think Garveyism, you don't think integration. Because if you want to integrate in somebody else's house, if you think Garveyism, you want to build your own house. And that factor is missing. All right, how then, in conclusion, how then do we use Garveyism at the end of the 19th as we face the 21st century? We use Garveyism to unify the African world across all religious and political lines, and to bring to ourselves once more the stability of the nation state. Of course, all of us in the United States are not going back to Africa. Go psychologically if you can't go physically. But if there's one place in the world Africa can turn to and say, send me 10,000 nurses, it's the United States. Probably couldn't send 10,000 doctors, probably couldn't even afford that many, but we could manage 5,000. Because in the United States you've got the best technical trained Africans in the world. Now they are confused with that technical training. I'm not saying they're committed to Africa with it. Kids study engineering, he'd rather go work for IBM or AT&T than to go to Africa. So long as you've got that kind of hang up, you're missing the point that I'm trying to get across. But I'm saying that with basic skills and road building and communication, building in general, managing school systems, managing hotels, the African in the United States might be the key or the lock to the Africa of the future. But if you think this is a betrayal of the United States, and you're missing the point again. Because there's nothing that you betray that the country didn't say it stands for. Not that it lives up to what it stands for, but it says it stands for. Then you have to do some reading in history. I don't believe there's a capitalist solution to Africa's problems. I don't think there's a communist solution either. I don't think there's any solution that you do not control and control well in Africa's behalf. I think the individualism of the Western black might have spoiled most of them for service in Africa. Africa had a collective society, not based on the needs of the individual, but based on the needs of the whole group. And many times, Africa had a class-less society and a sharing society, not only before Karl Marx, but before the existence of Europe. An African king, Pharaoh, Akhenaten, preached the same concept from a throne 1,300 years before Christ. So if you want socialism, you can get some at home. You don't have to go across and get it from Carl something or another. But if Carl something or another got anything that you can use for your benefit, use it. But don't forget to bend it to your benefit. Everything, every religion, every social organization has become an instrument of liberation, or it must become nothing, or you must discard it. You have to travel fast and with some light luggage. And you can't have any excess baggage holding back this matter. I think every true African, every true liberating person, every true person committed to the liberation and the unification of all African people have been saying one way or the other what Marcus Garvey said through his life and said repeatedly, "Up, up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will."
Before I introduce our next speaker, I'll provide one more opportunity. If several people want to just come up in front and sit down on the floor, you can feel free to do that. I want to thank Dr. Clarke very much for his very eloquent statements, and as I said, at the conclusion we will provide time for questions and answers. As I earlier stated, Dr. Ben will be addressing philosophical aspects of Garvey and his African nationalism. Dr. Yosef Ben-Jochannan.
Good evening. I think that I can use your bulletin to commence my presentation. It's quite appropriate for that. It says at the bottom of the front cover, "History is the landmark by which we are directed into the true course of life. The history of a movement, the history of a nation, the history of a race is the guidepost of the movement's destiny. That nation's destiny, that race's destiny, what you do today that is worthwhile inspires others to act at some future time." Marcus Garvey. The statements of Garvey, though profound, in most universities, and particularly in his major writings, the most knowledgeable of them all being the compilation by his second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey. His first wife was Amy Ashwood Garvey. It seems that Garvey like the Amy girls. But Garvey has been overlooked for a number of reasons. Were he not an African, his books, and particularly the first book of the two-volume work on Garvey, would have been considered a masterpiece of philosophy. When examining Garvey's work as a young man, it was necessary for me to go through a number of papers. Many of you do not know probably that Garvey was a poet. He wrote a number of short stories. Well, he was a literary great. But in his writing, Garvey mentioned something dealing with his philosophy and education. And for you here at the university, that makes it so important. One of the things in his philosophy of education, Garvey said, "What is an education?" He said, "It's not always what you take in. Very often, it's what you got to put out." I think most of us most of us. And I know that I myself, included at least one time, and probably there is some more house cleaning, I had to get rid of a lot of things that I had learned prior to reading Garvey and others. But when I look at the example of materials, when a cache of writings and different collections belonging to Garvey was uncovered some years ago, I got an opportunity to browse through some of them and noticed that Garvey was an avid reader of his ancient history. For that reason, Garvey took sentimentally and attached philosophically what is known as the Tricolors of Africa. Today, others are calling it the liberation color. Garvey never had anything called liberation color. He called it the Tricolors of Africa. The red, the white, and the red, black, and the green. You can go to Africa, and particularly to Egypt, and find in the temples those tricolor arranged in the same manner, red, black, and green in that order, and see where he adopted his colors or symbols for his movement. Using Edward Burrell Ford, Garvey found it necessary to have an anthem, not the United States anthem, not the British anthem, but the African people's anthem, Ethiopia, land of our fathers, land where the gods love to be. Garvey found it more necessary also. He was a devout Christian, but he realized that none of the Christian denominations within the United States or Great Britain or France or any of the other European colonial powers was sufficient to meet the needs of the African people. Thus Garvey created within his organization the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which he changed quickly to the African Orthodox Church, and set up an ex-Baptist minister, Terrell, to head that religion. Garvey knew it, knowing that Christianity by itself, as many people would have said, was a European religion, and people who say that do not know Christianity, because Christianity, Garvey stated and knew, came out of Alexandria, Egypt, from Pantius and Boetius. That Christianity had been in the continent of Africa, namely the nation of Tameri or Kemet, which the Greeks call Egypticus and the British call Egypt. Of course, the Hebrews call it Mizraim, and the present Arab conquerors call it Mizraim, and there are a number of other names. But Garvey knew that that religion, Christianity there, and of course it got its name Christianity from 212 of the Common Era at a place called Antioch, when the people start using the Greek words Joshua Christus and Christos, which means to anoint. Joshua the anointed. Up until that conference, he was called the leader. That's all. Of course, Garvey, in reading about this, made notations that Christianity was nothing but a carryover of the worship of Heru, or Horus, the son of Aset and Asaru. Aset is commonly called by the Greeks Isis, Asaru equally by the Greeks Osiris. Garvey knew, and in his notation, he knew for some reason, although he had never been on the physical continent of Africa, that at the various temples, primarily because he noted them, the temple of Setaiwan at Abydos, and may I remind you, the temple of Setaiwan at Abydos was before anybody named Moses was born in Egypt according to the Torah. Again, Garvey knew that at Dendera, the temple of goddess Heru, which the Greeks called Hathor, there was a story, and still is, for anyone who wants to go and see it, of the immaculate conception of Aset and the virgin birth of a child. Thus it is that Garvey established and re-established what was being worshipped in Ethiopia, the Black Madonna and Child, which was also worshipped in Europe, all over Europe, exclusively until Michelangelo in 1509 painted for Pope Julius II the first white Madonna and Child, Mary and Joseph. Of course, Garvey knew there was 16 such black Madonnas and Child, Jesus being the last of the 16. Garvey understood the concept of the fundamental principle of a religion, its moral laws, and he upheld them and taught them to his followers of his movement, the Universal Negro Association and African Communities League. Garvey reminded his people, his followers, and they had to be African, that it was impossible to live without a moral code. And when others asked about adopting the 10 Commandments, Garvey said no, he was not going to adopt any second-hand set of laws. Garvey knew that the 10 Commandments was a joke, that there was no Moses that gave to the world any 10 Commandments, because we don't have Moses until the 18th dynasty, and that Moses wasn't born before 1346 before the Common Era. And Garvey spoke of what was known as the 42 admonitions of Ma'at, or commonly called the 42 negative confessions, which we can find in the book of the Coming Forth by Day, which Budge, the Englishman, changed to Book of the Dead. And if you want, you can find them in the Osirian drama of the Book of the Dead, the 42 laws, such as, Hail Ma'at, I have not killed man nor woman. Hail Ma'at, I have not stolen. Hail Ma'at, I have not coveted another man's wife. Now in the Jewish folklore, that attribute to a man just came yesterday. And whereas in this book it is 4100 BC, or 3,000 years before Moses. And Garvey knew that if Moses was in fact a reality, that Moses is said to have been born in Africa at a place called Goshen in a state called Egypt, and the last time I saw Egypt to back Garvey was 3 weeks ago, and it's in Africa. So the fundamental things about this, Garvey knew that he could move his people because his people was quite capable. He knew Garvey had in his collection a book in which dealt with the papyrus of Hunefer, Hunefer. In the papyrus of Hunefer states, quote, "We came from the beginning of the Nile, where God happy dwell, at the foothill of the mountain of the moon," unquote. That is a paper of an Egyptian writing, Hunefer, the high priest, where they came from, the Egyptians. And by the way, there is no Greece yet. There is no Rome yet. There is no Israel yet. There is no Abraham yet. There is no Allah, no Muhammad ibn Abdullah yet, no Confucius. When Hunefer is writing this, these are a group of Africans in the world that is writing that. I mean, Homer is not born yet, the first literary European. And Homer is not until 833. Homer is to write. You see, that's one thing about Garvey, and he had another man with him by the name of H. Hubert Harrison, who was his historian, who could bring him up to date, that remind him that the first literary work in all of Europe was Homer, Iliad, and the Odyssey, which state in the Odyssey, Homer speaking about the Ethiopians. He said what? Even the gods Zeus and Apollo, the first gods of Europe, came from Ethiopia. Right. So Garvey knew and read these things. Upon these things and others, he was to base his philosophy. More so, Garvey knew that the African was a technical African. It is equivalent to these days. He would be a multi-genius equivalent to one of them by the name of Imhotep, or combined Imhotep. Imhotep was the man that designed the step pyramid of Saqqara out of solid stone, no brick made of any material, much less mud and straw. The step pyramid of Saqqara is in the 3rd dynasty. Imhotep designed it and built it for the pharaoh Zusa, whom Herodotus later come and call Zusa. May I remind you that Abraham, the first of the Jews, wasn't born. You can't build a pyramid when you're not born. And of the 72 pyramids in Egypt, all was born before Abraham, all was built before Abraham was born at the 13th dynasty in the city, or outside of the city of Ur in Chaldea, which later became an Egyptian-Ethiopian colony by the name of Elam. You see, these are some of the things that we need in our classrooms. Dr. Carter G. Woodson, who started this with 1 week and got fired by a black college president at Howard University by the name of Mordecai Johnson. Poor Mordecai. Well, we can't blame the poor fellow. He had no knowledge of himself. Carter G, the community protests make him rehired Carter G, and then he taught his first course in African studies, but he was not allowed to include it in the curriculum in a black university. There are other things, but we don't have time for that today. But Garvey, looking at all of these things, looking at medicine, and we were told that Hippocrates is the father of medicine. Well, that's not difficult, because Benny Goodman is the king of swing. But nevertheless, Garvey had looked at the number of medical writings or medical papyri. Notably, let's take one of them right in the Brooklyn Museum, the Edward C. Smith medical papyrus for surgery. And that's 1770 before the Common Era. Hippocrates wasn't born until 333. So this papyrus, this medical writing treatise, is 1400 years before the father of medicine. Garvey looking at these things, citing them, and writing individually in the world, in the Negro world. He would write a column on all kinds of different things. On economics, law, medicine, cited all of these things as he continued. You see, we only know Garvey for Back to Africa slogan, but we don't know the literary critic, the literary man Garvey. And that's the one we need to deal with a little. Garvey, examining this, dealt with medical writings like the Ebers Papyrus, a papyrus that deals with, during the time of Queen Hatshepsut, the first woman who acted as both king and queen. The first woman that, I think that if she was around, AIDS wouldn't have been too popular among, because she developed a suppository to insert into the vagina to stop pregnancy in 1555 before the Common Era. With all this knowledge then, and added to that the knowledge of Thutmose III, the son of the same Hatshepsut, who completed the expulsion of the first non-African people to have come into Egypt. With all that knowledge, Garvey then turned to examine, to establish not only the philosophical basis for his organization, but an economic concept that a man who amassed a fortune of more than $50,000, and you got to imagine the time in which he's speaking, in the 1920s, should not be add to that money, but should work from then on, and the money he make should go for the benefit of his people. That the $50,000 should be an a maximum he can hold in any bank account. So in order that others would eat. So he called it civilized capitalism. Capitalism not in the sense of what another African by the name of Alexander Hamilton had instituted in this country. Oh, by the way, I know a lot of people got frightened when I said that, so I better stop a minute to clarify that. I'm talking about the fellow that Burr killed, and American history lied and said it was for politics. It was over that blue-eyed girl in Philadelphia. You see, Burr knew that Hamilton was from Nevis, and he knew that Hamilton's father was an Englishman and his mother was an African, and that he was raised up in St. Croix, in what is now the United States Virgin Islands, at the time of the Danish Virgin Islands, where such children were sent to be raised, because the fathers couldn't have them with their European wives. Of course, there were many fathers with African wives at those times, since rape didn't start with black people doing it. I mean, the slave didn't rape the master's wife. Somebody got raped, but it wasn't the master's wife. Garvey knew that too, so more than anybody else. He saw it constantly in Jamaica. Garvey running down, as these are stuff, it moved Garvey to ask the question. When he wrote his poem, "Wake Up, Ye Mighty Race," Garvey again speaking said in his philosophical concept that the African must have one God, he must have one aim, and he must have one destiny. After that, he brought forward the catchwords, the motto, "By block." Garvey said that these things to many will sound as if it is racism. He said, but in these United States and in the 12 colonial powers of Europe, he was speaking specifically of those who had gone and established their control over the world in what was then called the Berlin Conference, a conference called by Otto von Bismarck and Wilhelm the Kaiser in 1884, which discussed, adjudicated, and came up with the conclusion called the Berlin Convention and Conference and document, of which the United States of America participated fully. The representative of the United States of America was Edwin H. Terrell, carrying the title Minister Plenipotentiary and Ambassador Extraordinary. The subsequent conference to that was called the Brussels Conference. That is the conference that followed the Berlin Conference, where Leopold was given the richest part of Africa as his personal estate, backed by the United States government, its Senate and its Congress, and of course Ulysses S. Grant, its president. You may find these documents in a 3-volume works called A Map of Africa by Treaty, as edited by the royal historian of Queen Victoria, Sir Edward H. Herxley. So that when they tell you in school that the United States had nothing to do with the partition of Africa, somebody's lying. It's too well documented, and you could read the congressional records, and you will find to the contrary. At the Brussels conference, which was called later after the European powers, England and others, tried to rob from Leopold after they found they had given him the richest part, the Brussels conference the United States was represented by Casson. I forget at this moment Casson's first name, but with the same title as Edwin Terrell. All of these matters Garvey had to use to come up with his various hypotheses and subsequent philosophy. In the Philosophy and Opinions of Marcus Messiah Garvey, the first book of the 2-volume book edited by his wife, the second wife, Amy Jacques Garvey, Garvey wrote extensively on all concept, all detail. The reason Garvey said it was necessary to have a paramilitary organization in the United States, he felt that it was impossible for a nation of people, and Garvey saw the African in the United States, the Africans anywhere in Europe, as a nation within a nation. Garvey said it was impossible to integrate a slave with a master. And Garvey said, whenever the slave accepts that he's the master, solely because the master have relieved him by removing the shackles of slavery, and that the slave did not force the master to remove the shackle. The reason the master could feel safe in removing the shackle is because he knows that the shackle is no longer and the physical property of the human being, but it has gone to his brain. And we see it quite often when we look at the mirror. You take Michael Jackson, for example. And it seems that this singing sends them crazy, because that's on the male side. But we could take Diana Ross on the other side. Since the Africans believe in the law of opposite, it is necessary that we put male and female so that no one hollow sex discrimination. In terms of Garvey again in the philosophy, let us try to look at the bi-black situation and to see if it had any aspect of racism. Garvey, in saying bi-black, he felt, and as he did, where Garvey put his mouth, he equally put his dollars, or at least his people's dollars. Garvey built for them economic institution, the newspaper, the Black Star Line, the shipping company, bakeries, grocery stores, and he started to manufacture, because Garvey said, if only we could sell one match to each Chinese per year, we would have an industry that will be able to occupy every African in the Western world. He said, our problem isn't being invited to the Rockefellers for dinner. That is it, because we may not like the way they cook anyhow, because they don't use much seasoning. He says, and then we can't reciprocate. We will be at a total disadvantage. He said, wherever we are, we must control the economy in that spot. He said, no people begging for a dinner can have dignity or respect. No man who cannot support his wife can be respectful of her. I rather repeat that one. There's a big clamor about black men leaving, and Garvey cited it. Black men leaving their family, and the society saying it is a racial trait in black men. Garvey asked, how come that trait doesn't work in Africa? It's only over here. How come it didn't work in slavery? Garvey said, in slavery we fight like hell to establish marriage when the society didn't allow us to marry. We established our own rules. When they said we couldn't go to the church and get married, we then established our rule for marriages. Not only did we do that, but we understood that the significance of it, it was not a matter just for something called holiness. Because we know that isn't the reason people marry. It has nothing to do with heaven. Because what God put together, man can't put asunder. So don't say it's stupidness anyhow. Garvey said that the reason for marriage is a security for the woman and her family. It got nothing to do, but because if God is so bad and want a marriage to stay together and then want somebody to break it, he killed the man who's trying to break it. Or kill the woman who's trying to break it. So since God has nothing to do with it, let's deal with it. It's man. And you can't protect a marriage when you're broke. Because your wife can't eat love. She can't put it in the pot. Garvey maintained for the African man to have dignity, he must control his economy. If he controls his economy, then he can give to his wife what other men do for their wives. But if he does not, he will forever be a man whose wife is subject to abuse and whom he can never protect. I mean, Garvey's philosophical thoughts were fundamental. And one thing Garvey said, particularly, I should probably say from before, in endorsing what Dr. Edmund Blyden had already said in accepting the presidency of the College of Liberia in 1883, in context with the previous statement that was made, Africa for the African, to which Garvey had already added those at home and those abroad. Blyden is speaking about the beauty of the African woman, had maintained that the African woman has no other woman to set an example for her beauty. That is something I wish the African woman here had heard Garvey speaking about. Let me repeat that. I mean, I think it's good. It caught me to my funny bone. Brothers, what Garvey said. And I know most of the sisters do certain things because you aren't looking at her. And she's trying to look like a European because you like to look at Europeans. That's right. I remember a few years ago she wanted you to look at her in her African splendor. As Garvey said, at the Brother Brat of the Garvey movement, the Grandiosa models in the 60s, they wore the hair natural. You couldn't accept the natural African look. You made her put a name to it, Afro. Now I don't know how you could spell Africa with an O in it. But then being in college you get sophisticated. So from now on we spell Africa A-F-R-O-C-A. Africa. But Garvey maintained it, just like the other day I heard Bo Derek gave us the cornrow. I don't know if now I know I'm 69, I know Bo Derek isn't 69. Now I know I saw my mother when I was knee-high to a grasshopper, cornrowing her own hair, cornrowing my sister hair, and she would have cornrowed my daddy hair, but he didn't go for no faggotry. He said no. that the African woman's beauty is matched by no other woman, because she has her own texture of hair, her own physical shape. And then Garvey went down to remind us, why are we the way we are? And Garvey said, if we had narrow nose in all that heat in Africa, we'll suffocate. For the heat to get out the brain. And it's a fact. If we had this thick lips, thin lips in Africa, we could not, in all that heat, kiss conveniently. You girls who have never been kissed by a thick lip, you have never been kissed before. I am speaking from experience. I have one. And Garvey spoke of the hair. Since man did not come here with hat on, and with the kind of sun we have in Africa, the hair, the kinky hair, was made by nature to do as what the straight hair does in Europe. If the Europeans had started out with kinky hair, with all the ice and the snow, it would have done the opposite of what the woolen hair, or so on and so on. The light skin in the icy places is better for the European than the dark skin, whereas the dark skin would be better for the African for the amount of sun, the sun ray. So nature wasn't crazy when it did for its people what it had to do. We are the crazy one who thought that nature was crazy and start to try to look like everybody else than ourselves. And Garvey, in examining all of that, most of us thought that all Garvey thought of was his nationalism. Yes, he was an African nationalist to the core. He lived it, he slept it, and he died for it. But Marcus, winding down, Marcus Messiah Garvey was especially conscious of one thing: the African man and his African woman. It is something we need to read a little more, if not Garvey, somebody else. Garvey's devotion to a wife. Certainly some people made a lot of dissension with the first wife and caused Garvey to lose his cool, being human, and divorce her. His subsequent or second wife, he treated his sons, the two sons, he had no daughters, Julius and Marcus Julia, both of whom I saw today at the Board of Education in Brooklyn. But he supported them to the best of his ability. So much so that he set a guide. Marcus Jr. is an engineer, and Marcus, young Marcus, the younger of the two brothers, Julius, is a medical doctor and psychiatrist. One thing Marcus Garvey reminds us, he said, show me a black man who mistreats his woman, and I show you a black man without any pride. Garvey reminds us that our women are the first heaven we have. Garvey reminds us that we are looking up in the air for heaven when it sleeps in bed with us. Garvey reminds us that each and every one of us came out of heaven. The abysmal deep that they are speaking about in the Bible is the placenta. the abysmal, deep, dark, abysmal. If you think back of the woman placenta, you can't see anything inside of it. There is fluid in it, and that's where we stay for 10 months normally, not 9 by the way. And but Garvey reminds us of the various statues we see in Egypt. For example, God Mim, the god of fertility, who's always seen with an erected penis hanging out, straight, horizontal, perpendicular to the earth surface. And remind us, as the Egyptians show, the penis coming from the navel, the umbilical cord, an extension of life. Garvey said to us, if we would remember that our first experience of heaven is our mother's womb, then we, those of us who think and call ourselves an African nationalist, must first think, must first honor, must first realize, show me the way you treat your woman, and I'll show you the condition of your race.
There was a young man who read a poem a couple of days ago I spoke to from the very beginning. I don't know if he's still here, and I have to admit that I forgot about him. Is he still here? Let me have him come up for one quick moment. This is Brother Ayen, and he has a very special tribute for us all, but particularly to one individual. And I'd just like for all of us to pay particular attention to this young brother and listen to his poem. Brother Ayen.
Today, we are celebrating Black History Month, and I ask myself, who are we? Are we Negroes? Are we niggers? Are we mulattoes? Are we coloreds? Or are we blacks? Again I ask, is there any place on earth called Negro land? Is there any place called Nigger land? Is there a place called Mulatto land? Is there a place called Colored land? Or is there any place on this earth called Black land? But I know there is a vast, beautiful, and rich continent from where my ancestors came. I also know that this continent is the birthplace of modern man, Homo sapiens sapien. And I do know that this continent is the cradle of civilization, Africa, Africa, Africa. Yes, this I know. I am a proud African, but I am also an American. I am therefore a proud African American celebrating African American History Month. And I shall continue to learn all I can about the history and culture of my people. Now I ask myself, who are these people? Are they kings? Are they queens? Are they heroes? Or are they heroines? Yes, it is true. They are the Mensa Mooses, the Shakas, the Ossie Tutus. They are the Nzingas. They are the Frederick Douglasses, the Richard Allens, the Marcus Garveys. They are the Sojourner Truths, the Harriet Tubmans, the Mary McLeod Bethunes. And they are the Kwame Nkrumahs, the Jomo Kenyattas, the Nelson Mandelas. They are the Annie Bites, the Winnie Mandelas. They are the Malcolm X's, the Whitney Youngs, the Martin Luther Kings. And they are the Rosa Parks, Shirley Chisholms, and Barbara Jordans. Certainly, they are the kings and queens of Africa. They are the hero and heroines of the Americas. They are the fathers and mothers, sons and daughters. They are the descendants of the motherland, Africa. And this I know for sure. I am a proud African. I am a proud American. I am a proud African American with the same blood of Mother Africa. The same blood given to these kings and queens, heroes and heroines, running through my veins. For I am a proud African American celebrating African American History Month.
I want to thank Brother Yen. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a question and answer period. And in having that question and answer period, I will, if you have a question, I will call upon you. And if you would just indicate who you are directing the question to, either Dr. Ben or Dr. Clarke, or to the two brothers. Before, I'm just trying to give Dr. Ben an opportunity just to rest for a moment, but I do want to say this once again, that on Thursday, February 11th, we will have Dr. Adlai Sanford and Dr. Donald Smith, and at the present time we will be meeting in this room, but if there are changes from that, we'll certainly post it on the door and directing you where you ought to go. And I also like to, I neglected at the, when you start mentioning names, you always get into trouble. But I certainly want to thank the members of the NOAA staff for all that they've done to make this Black History Month possible, and for just really being there, because it's very difficult putting these kinds of things together. I want to thank the students in the NOAA program who helped send the Black History announcements through the mail. Most of you have received something in the mail, and it took someone putting that in the envelope and getting it to you. And I also want to thank our brothers John Matthews and brothers Terrence Fudge for all that they've done to make this Black History Month possible here at Hofstra University. Without any further ado, we'll have your questions and their answers. Any questions? The gentleman standing in the back. Okay, you'll have to speak just a little bit louder.
Brother, you alluded to some of the causes of white supremacy. And just the other day I saw on the Donald show, Dr. Frances Garvey. I don't know if you're familiar with her work. She was also saying that part of the reason for white supremacy is because white people know, or the Europeans know, that the black male has the capability in his sperm to annihilate their whole race because their genes are recessive. So that white supremacy is also partially based on that. And I wanted to know, what was your opinion of that theory, the crest theory of white supremacy?
Well, I'm familiar with Dr. Welson's theory, or crest theory. It is part of the answer. The other part of the answer is really in the rise of Europe and the insecurity of Europe in the face of the vast number of people in the world that are not European. Nature plays weird tricks. Most of the resources that's needed to turn capital over and to turn the wheels of Western industry, most of the resources are in the lands of non-European people. And for the Europeans to continue to take these resources free of charge, continue to rape these lands, or to continue to get it cheap, they have to go through a motion of assuming that the people have no ability to develop this to themselves, although the Japanese have proved them wrong on this point, because 200 years ago the Japanese didn't even have a good wheelbarrow, and look at them now.
It also has to deal with the maintenance of a concept of color prejudice that started in the 15th and the 16th century. The assumption that there was something special about color, and the European has made a virtue out of a physical defect, the absence of color.
The young lady standing in front.
Okay, my question is addressed to Dr. Clarke also. I'm listening to your speech and it's I enjoyed it very much. I'm a Jamaican. I've been living here in the United States for exactly a year, 7 months, 2 weeks. And I couldn't help but wonder why you seem to almost write Jamaica off as a lost cause. In the sense that if Marcus Garvey was to come to Jamaica at this point in time, he would probably be stoned. There are no sympathizers for Marcus Garvey in Jamaica. I am, as I would like to describe myself, a budding Pan-Africanist. Teaching which I've learned back home. Marcus Garvey is a national hero back home. Mutabaruka, the dub poet, is a Pan-Africanist. Many of our musicians, young people. I mean, there is a change in face in Jamaica, which I felt you omitted by just referring to probably a traditionalist, a staunch traditionalist back home, as opposed to a younger generation and change in face.
I can understand you taking exception. I've lived in Jamaica, and I was in Jamaica only a few weeks ago at a conference on Marcus Garvey. I still think Jamaica is the most stratified of all the Caribbean nations along color and class lines. The powerful, entrenched, class conscious and color conscious Jamaican who stopped Marcus Garvey the first time is more powerful now than ever. Marcus Garvey is a national hero, and yet you cannot read books about Marcus Garvey. It's not in Jamaican public libraries. There's no course on Marcus Garvey in a single college in Jamaica. There's no primer on the life of Marcus Garvey. What kind of national hero is this? And what kind of nation with black consciousness would elect a white man from Boston as prime minister?
Gentlemen. Yes, sir.
I have two questions. At one point in time, I read that young Elijah Muhammad was a lieutenant under Marcus Garvey's time. Is this true?
I mean?
Yeah. Either one of them.
That is correct. Before, when he was still a minister of the Baptist Church, he was a lieutenant in Garvey's movement. When he became in his own movement, when he was calling himself Mut at the time at 128th Street, he was still in the movement. He left the movement when he went to the Moorish science. And after Moorish science, then he established his version of Islam.
Second question. Would you say that he carried on the same thing?
No, he carried some aspect. The economic aspect was basically an idea from Garvey. I would say, other than that, it was a rugged departure.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
In Harold Cruz's latest book, he talks about the development of the black political convention movement of the 1970s. What do you see as the potentials of a black political party in the U.S., and what do you think are some of the problems? Either one.
Look, I'm familiar with Harold Cruz. We grew up together intellectually after the war. Harold Cruz is
an uncanny genius in choosing good titles for books and writing poor books behind the titles. Both of his books are misleading. This one is called Plural But Equal. Interesting title. But we were not brought to America to be equal. It is a plural society.
I'm not in favor of...
All whites are not equal. Let's get something straight about this country. This country was found as a haven for free white Protestant males, middle class and up, those who agreed with the prevailing political status quo and who owned property. Everybody else in the country is second. Catholic, Jews, everybody. Second to that. Women too. Women got to vote day before yesterday. No, the convention movement really started in the 19th century.
Right, I'm familiar with that, but I'm talking about in terms of the 70s. Do you think there's potential for a black political party? What do you think that potential is, and what do you think would be the problems involved?
I haven't decided whether it's even a necessity. I think a black political force, the unity of blacks on a political purpose, blacks knowing what they want from the political structure and unifying to get it, is far more important than a separate black political party. A separate party, if you think will do any good, but a political force is essential to all time.
Do you think the Black Caucus is what you're talking about when you say that?
Well, the Black Caucus is a minimal thing. It's not big enough to be considered on the same level.
Okay. Yeah. There was
I feel slighted in this book. He's always accustomed to give John and myself hell in all his books. And he isn't cursing us in this book. I wonder, John, if in his old days he's getting reformed. I guess no one knew me until Harold Cruz mixed me up with The Voice and John and others, and thought, of course, Harold have never had a new idea. He has other people's idea and criticize it. And he's done the same in this book. But a convention, just take reality. Let us say America went real crazy and voted for Jesse Jackson. I mean, we all went mad. Black, white, technicolor, and rainbow. Who is going to be the head of the army? Who is going to run Wall Street? Who is going to be the Secretary of State, etc., etc.? It will make a damn difference if Jesse's grandmother was the president. You're still going to have capitalism, rugged and all kind of it. And if Jesse lived to pass the electoral college, you see, you forget that Americans don't vote for a president. They go through an exercise of futility, because it's going to be the electoral college that decide who's going to bring the president. 3 times or 4 times American popular vote was reversed. Don't think that America will kill John F. Kennedy, Roosevelt, Lincoln, and others, and won't kill Jesse. I think Jesse knows that he gonna win. He's just making a position. He wants to go to the convention with his strength. He wants to be able to negotiate for a few ambassadors, a few, let's face it, and get a few dollars for himself. And I'm with him. Get some money, Jesse. You got a family to support.
I'm a practical and impractical dreamer on the situation. I want Jesse to get so many votes
they have to throw it in the house. Then when they throw it in the house, I know they're going to steal it from him. And the nature of the stealing will be a political lesson for all of us.
There was a lady in the back who had a question.
Right here.
Okay, well, let me go to the back and then I'll go over there.
I read that in Africa many centuries ago that one was respected based on their blackness, especially the black ladies, that it was considered beautiful to be black, and that they looked up to the enlightenment with greatness, that the young girls would paint themselves with black berries. They were very proud. What caused us as a people to become ashamed of our blackness?
White images, starting with the Bible. White Jesus, gave us a disrespect for the black father in the home. Missionary concepts of color, propaganda, cause us to lose faith in ourselves. I've seen people in Africa, black and proud and beautiful, in the Sudan, and I've seen some blue black people. Most beautiful blackness I've ever seen in my life. Velvety looking blue. No apologies. When Nkrumah came to power, I was head of a culture unit of the anti-poverty program. I got the film and I got the tape and I showed it to my students. I said, look, he's addressing the world. He's speaking to the United Nations. He had even combed his hair. He no bleaching cream. He's black and he like it that way. In the last public speech of James Baldwin at Cornell, a white student asked a white male student, after all the years and you're famous now with money, aren't you tired of people discriminating against you because of your blackness? Isn't it a problem to you? He said, no problem to me, but I'm worried because it's still a problem to you. And he said, I like it the way it is. I wear it well. I dig it. But if you can't understand it, then that's your problem.
I think in the Tanzania Gazette, there's a nice thing. When Tanzania got independent, there was one British woman who was in the Tanganyika legislature during the British administration for quite some time, and she couldn't stand the idea to see her beloved Tanganyika go to the natives. And so the Tanganyika Gazette did a little comic strip. They show a missionary man come with his British hat, his short pants and his high socks and boots coming up on the shore. And then the little missionary boy running in on the shore. An African woman in her house peeping through the window, and a little African boy playing with the missionary's son. And the caption said, Ngulu, I tell you never to play with your dinner. It was to show the attitude of Europeans of how they thought about Africans, but the thought remained the same, but the African has still regained his land. Another caption is, and I'm finished here, but we like to use Bro and Nancy's stories before they became Uncle Remus stories. A missionary arrived because this is one of our worst problems. They said that the Africans ate the missionaries and we didn't eat them, and that was our biggest mistake. But it's not too late to start eating them. But this missionary came and he tried to convert everything he could see. And he didn't get any Africans because Africans by now had started to get back on the track. But there was a lion coming up who had been wounded, and you know, a wounded lion in spark can't catch anything. And so the lion was coming up like this, and the missionary started to pray, "Oh Lord, I don't know what I'm going to do because I promised you I will come here to civilize these people and to bring them to your faith." And so just then the lion came, watched the missionary, and stood down with his paws up in his place and started, "Ooh." And the missionary said, "Oh Lord, I want to change something. I didn't get a human being here, but I got a lion who is praying to you." And the lion stopped and watched the missionary and said, "I don't know what you're asking the Lord for, but I'm thanking the Lord for my first dinner."
Someone on the side here had a question? Yes, sir.
Excuse me, Dr. Ben, I'd like to ask you a question related to education. I think everyone in the room, if not them, then the children, go to schools in New York State. And I believe New York State Department of Education mandates or dictates the curriculum to be taught in the various schools throughout the state. And my question to you is there any formal course or courses given with regard to Afro-American studies in the social studies of our schools?
In some schools, there's still, you can still have, but it's dependent upon the teacher. And you know, even at the college level, there is such a thing as a curriculum committee. That's the fellows that chop up your course or say it can't go through. But nobody can stop me from teaching what I want under any title. I mean, I could teach a course called Restrictions Not to Say African, and teach Africa in it, because I use one of the other names for Africa, and I will speak about it. It's like it all. You see, excuses are out of mode after the 60s, at least 69 and so forth, when youngsters went to the street, when the youngsters in Cornell took up guns against the New York State policemen, when youngsters all over, when they burned the universities, and we have to get back to that. You know, I got to say, I probably wouldn't be here. I probably wouldn't be here at Hofstra, sitting down today, if young black people didn't burn the place. I mean, let's face it. I mean, we are brilliant. John is a brilliant brother, and I'm no slouch. But we wouldn't have been here. We were there before 1969. We had to pay people. We were paying at 310 Lenox Avenue with Richard Moore. We used to pay people 25 cents to come upstairs to hear the lecture. And that was a lot of money. 25 cents to get a 3-course dinner for the divine. Yeah. And we had such people as Langston Hughes, John, Richard Moore, and I could go on and go on. And for entertainment, we had Philippa Schuyler. Then she was a child genius before she went out of mind. And then all those different things. And no one, people didn't want to come. We had to literally kidnap people and carry them upstairs to listen to their own history. So it was never a time. We had Dr. Seifert and his institute. There were a number of academies. Even J.A. Rogers writing in the Pittsburgh Courier and other people. There was never a time when we were short of telling our people our history. Of course, you know, Marcus Garvey was loaded with, when, if I tell you, J. Philip Randolph, all those fellows were with Garvey. Randolph were with Garvey. And a number of fellows who turned the other side, became Norman Rockwell socialists, Marxists, and all kind of things like that, were with Garvey. It doesn't say that they didn't know. If those men stayed with Garvey, you see, they went to look for a better bread. Like most of us with our PhDs. I remember when John was teaching in how you act. Literally, and in little housing project in the little room there, I was lecturing in front of chock full of nuts and 125th Street and 7th Avenue with a ladder, and Thursday, Friday, and Saturday and Sunday afternoon. Coming from teachers' colleges, a professor teaching on the corner. My members of my own family won't speak to me. John could tell a member of his family won't speak to his wife, his first wife won't speak to him. We were crazy. So I'm saying, if we put our mind to it, and I know, let's face it, we don't run New York City Public School. And people don't think for others as they think for themselves. It's a reality. Don't expect that other people going to leave their personal interests for yours.
I want to have a continuing comment on that.
Just a very short comment, because there are a lot of folks with questions.
Long-winded, you know.
Okay, well, don't you be equally as long-winded, because we can't hear him. Okay.
So, very specifically, Dr. Ben, when I was a child, they called social studies geography. And as a youngster, studying geography, Africa was known to be far removed in a very negative state. My point is that as a youngster, I had to fantasize about geography because all they taught was white history. Now today, and I think that if everybody here has any inkling as to what the New York State Board of Education is supposed to be doing, and they have representatives called regents, I think the communities, if they're concerned and interested in having a curriculum instituted or implemented in their respective schools, then the regents people are the people to write to.
Yeah, but if you have gone and seen a regent meeting, I guess you remember a fellow named Clarke, not Dr. John Henrik. I'm talking about the other Clarke. The Kenneth Clarke. That's another Clarke, another era. But he told you the Board of Regents had meetings to which he didn't know, and which he couldn't attend because the places they had it is for whites only. I don't think they could do it too easily with Alice Sanford, but they got techniques. The reality, again, we got to re-emphasize. We're in a system that is not for our benefit. As John said in the beginning, this system is an extension of Europe. And it's Judeo-Christian in background, what they call Judeo-Christian. And it functions for that. It's Judeo-Christian, Greco-Romano, and nothing that, anything that doesn't fit in that, going to have to fight and constantly fight. And as John was starting, Europeans are not racist against Africans alone. They are racist against Europeans. French people don't like to live. I mean, if you Italian, you're moving in a French neighborhood, it is hell. If you're German, you move it. And then remember, let's face the fact. When you said Jewish, what are you talking about? They're black Jews and they're brown Jews and yellow Jews. But when you say white Jews are white. In white good society. You doubt it? Move in a white Jewish neighborhood, or a white Italian neighborhood, or a white Greek neighborhood, and see if all whites don't move. That's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ben.
Yes, sir. Speak just a little louder, please.
When was the first recorded date of the education system of Africa? And could you explain to me why was the sign of peace, what is now known as swastika, why did that change to the law of opposites that you have?
Nobody, no one knows when was the first day of education in the continent of Africa, because you're talking about 11.3 million square miles. But the oldest record of the Nile Valley, Egypt, and Egypt wasn't the first, by the way, is Pwanit, now called Somalia. Kenya and Uganda used to be the old nation of Pwanit, which later the Jews called Punt in the allegorical story. Our records, we have archaeological records of hieroglyphs which shows writing that goes back to about 25,000 writings that we could decipher now. If you go back to the Grimaldis and others, you have other writings there, the picture writings. If you go into the Tassili Mountains with the fresco there, you have writing, the symbolic writing, it goes 450,000 years ago. That make Adam and Eve look sick. So then, we don't know when education started. We know though that the Grand Lodge of Saqqara, and Saqqara is started with at least the 3rd dynasty with Imhotep and Zusa, that at that place they had what they call a lodge, the Grand Lodge, the temple, where education, but remember, education must have been way before that, because since a man had to stay 40 years in school after entering in school at age 7, being circumcised, and then started, at 40 years later you get your priesthood designation. Instead of a PhD you get the name of priest, and you know all the subjects there were. So it was, I could say, education in Africa started before Adam and Eve. There was no Adam and Eve mentioned any place when education, because Adam and Eve started with is a Jewish, a Hebrew, a concept coming out of the Sanhedrin, and you don't have no Hebrew before Abraham, and you don't have no Sanhedrin until 700 BC. So even before the concept of Adam and Eve, Africans had writing and education.
Okay, why was the Gramadan,
the Gramadan?
Why does that change to? Why does that change?
Hitler moved it to a swastika. If you go to the museum, the Metropolitan, no, the Museum of Natural History at 79 to 81st Street on 8th Avenue or Central Park West, and the second floor section called the Hall of Men in Africa, you would see the Togolese clothing. You see Gramadans all over it, and what is called an eagle, which they now call a German eagle. Saint Maurice Aragon, that became the patron saint of Germany, this African from Togo, who went to Rome and then was sent from Rome to be bishop of Germany and then murdered, wore the Togolese eagle and the Gramadan, and their Gramadan at the feet of Buddha, the Gramadan all over. Gramadan is old as 40,000 years. The difference is that Hitler turned the legs around, that's all. But what they call a swastika is Hitler's copy, because Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm had colonized Togo and the Togolese brought that symbol there. That's where the Germans got what they call the swastika.
Okay, question all the way in the back, Mr. Poe. Speak loud, Mr. Poe.
I recently did some research on Jewish Nairi and his fight for independence was Ted Belika. You have to excuse me, I'm going to show it. And I was wondering, it seems to me that Marcus Garvey and Julius Nyerere had similar beliefs of self-sufficiency in Africa for Africa. I was wondering, how can we as Africans, people of African descent in America, make these efforts manifest here?
I got to disagree with you both, buddy. Not Julius Nyerere. Julius Nyerere does believe in integration. Marcus Messiah Garvey will have died rather than integrate with anyone other than an African woman. It was inconsistent with Garvey to think of cross-mating. You could call it racist or not. He believed that the survival of his people, if you're going to do that, do it at a later date. But he said, you first have to consolidate your forces before you could start talking about integration. Nyerere barred me from coming to the, what, the 7-pack they call it?
6-pack.
The 6-pack in Tanzania, because my speech was a speech supporting Garvey. By the way, I was barred from Guinea by Secretary for the same speech supporting Marcus Garvey. Both of those men said that they did not stand for any such philosophy of race. So I don't, not Judas Mary, who kneels down in front of the Pope and kiss the ring.
As far as economic self-sufficiency for Africa and for Africans as a neighborhood, as far as concerned integration, I didn't research that part of Julius Nyere's life, being an integrator.
Julius Nyerere. Then look at the cabinet. Look at the role of the Indians in Tanzania. Look and see if in Tanzania, if you go up to the post office, if an Indian can still walk in front of you and get served.
Okay, we're going to take about 2 additional questions. Gentleman sitting in the front.
Yes, I'd like to address this to both Dr. Ben and Dr. Carter. I was just wondering, when looking at Isis and Osiris and Horus, the story of Isis and Osiris and Horus, and looking at the Bible as it is now, you see some similarities, but there are also some inconsistencies in the current Bible. I was just wondering, could you point out some of the inconsistencies and also give us a point of reference which we could look at as far as periodicals are concerned?
This is solely Dr. Ben's answer. This is his particular area of research.
One of the major inconsistencies with the Mary and Jesus and Joseph take off of Isis, I'm using the Western usage of the name, Isis or Horus and Osiris, is number 1. The West has used the word Virgo to mean hymen. And in the ancient Africans of Egypt and elsewhere, when they spoke of the Immaculate Conception, they didn't mean that a woman who had no sexual intercourse and that her hymen was not broken. The Immaculate Conception was a clean thought, a clean person. For example, a woman who got pregnant never touched another man but the man that made her pregnant, and up to the delivery never touched another man but the man that made her pregnant, had an immaculate conception. And she gave birth to a virgin child. It has nothing to do if she had 30 children before. As a matter of fact, they cleaned it up a little in the book but said Jesus and his brothers and sisters. You can't be the human phallus and the woman vagina. That we have to be ashamed of it, we can't even talk about it. And in those days, you go in all the temples and you see Goddess Mut naked, you see God Mim naked, the god of fertility. You see Goddess Mut giving birth even to the sun from her vagina, and the sun coming out in the morning and going back. The Western concept of the Romanized concept of this is even to deny Jesus the act of manhood. 33 years old and he don't know what sex is in a polygamous country.
Just want to follow up on that. Periodical follow-up. Could you give us a periodical which we could use as a point of reference?
Oh yes, there are a lot of I think you could read Anacalypsis, a 2-volume work, Anacalypsis, Analypsis, by Sir Godfrey Higgins, 2 volumes. Man and His Gods by Homer W. Smith. The 16 Crucified Saviors by Kersey Graves. Bible Myths and Their Parallels in Other Religions by Thomas Downes. Christianity Before Jesus by John Jackson. Also by Annie Besant. There's equally 2 people who wrote that. I mean 2 different books by the same name. Take out the 13-volume works by Sir James Fraser called The Golden Bow, and read the proceeding of the Nicene Conference of Bishops, because it is at the proceedings of the Nicene Conference of Bishops in 325, ordered by Constantine the Roman Emperor, that Christianity was denuded of its sexuality. and given a Roman connotation of, but you got to remember the background. When these things are written, what was Greece at the time? The Greek soldiers went to the battlefield and lived there. And Greek men would bet, the generals bet, married 35 years, and they would bet that the wife still was untouched. Why they need a wife for when they had a boy on the field? You got to remember the background, what the Romans were thinking of. Look at Michelangelo's painting. Michelangelo look at painting of men. Any man in here is small. Our dean here has got a good build, and he will be miniature. Michelangelo got these big men and penis about a ½ inch. Look, go to the Sistine Chapel and see the mind of Michelangelo. And then you get an idea. These are the men that projected the pictures, the image. Look at the life of Pope Julius. His romantic life with his boyfriends.
Okay. Young lady in the front.
I'd like to direct my question to Dr. Ben. You had spoken previously on the economy of black Afro-Americans. We do realize that there are flaws in the economy, and I'd like for you to elaborate on what you feel we can do to rectify those flaws.
You can't do a thing in American economy to rectify it. I can't, and I don't know practically anybody in this room. Even Bosky can't. And he dropped 9 million one day. There's a fellow dropped 50 million one day in Florida and went and shot everybody he could.